Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Feliz, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this CLET World Languages webinar titled Teaching Grammar Communicatively and in Context. It's our pleasure to bring you new professional development opportunities. I leave the floor to my colleague, Catherine Miner.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Catherine Miner. I am one of our world language sales consultants here at CLET World Languages, and it is really my absolute pleasure to be here this evening to host this webinar with Joshua Cabral, who is someone I have had the pleasure of meeting in person, speaking with several times, and just hearing all about both his passion and his expertise for world language teaching. So I can't wait to hear what he's going to share with us this evening. Joshua has been teaching French and Spanish at the elementary, middle, and high school level for 26 years. He regularly presents workshops on language proficiency and cultural competence at state, regional, and national conferences. Joshua has done extensive graduate work in applied linguistics and second language acquisition, and he consults with schools and districts throughout the USA, working towards building and improving proficiency-based programs. He is passionate about access to education and also works closely with schools in Haiti and Nicaragua, where he travels to work with teachers and students. And he also is also the host of the World Language Classroom podcast. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Joshua, and I'll be back at the end to help moderate our question and answer session. So as Sabrina reminded everyone, please do put those questions that you have throughout the presentation in the Q&A section throughout the webinar. All right, Joshua, thank you very much. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for that kind welcome. And just going to get my screen set up so we can get going here. So hello, everyone, and welcome. I really appreciate you being here and everything that we will get to talk about tonight. So we are going to talk about teaching grammar communicatively and in context. Now, you'll notice that I put a picture of the proverbial cart before the horse up there as sort of our tag for what we're going to be doing, because that's sort of the starting point that when we talk about grammar and we talk about communication, it has been the legacy way of going about it. And you'll notice I use the term legacy when I talk about the way things have traditionally been done. I like the word legacy rather than old school or traditional, because it honors the work of teachers and the best of intentions throughout their careers. So traditionally, or the legacy way of looking at communicative language teaching and language teaching in general, has sometimes led with grammar and then trying to retrofit that into some sort of communication, whereas we're going to look at flipping that and looking at communication first. We'll definitely get into all of that as we go through, but as you see the cart before the horse, that's what the reference is. So keep that in mind as we're going through. So I am Joshua Cabral, and as you heard, I have been teaching for 26 years, and I've done work at the high school, middle school, and elementary school level. And I also host the World Language Classroom podcast. So join me over there. There may be a number of you on right now who are listeners who have actually been on the podcast with me or have heard about it. So I would love for you to join in, because we talk about a lot of these issues in teaching all the time. And let's start to jump right in and look at what we're going to be getting into. So what are we going to be looking at with our time together tonight? So essentially, just going to move something around my screen. Okay, so what are we going to see today or tonight? I am a bit of a research person. I like to look at research so that what we are doing is based on really empirical research rather than anecdotal or things that work. So we are going to start from a part of research, but I'm not a boring kind of research person. That's definitely not my style. But we will start by looking at it so it sort of lays the groundwork for the reason why we're doing things. Because a lot of times, again, anecdotally, and if we're in workshops, sometimes it's sort of, okay, I hear that that's working for you, but what's the reason why? And when we truly understand the why behind things, then we can adapt it to our own needs. So that'll be our starting point. And then we're going to look back at the cart before the horse and really what that means. And even though we're going to look at specific ways of addressing grammar in our classrooms and how we go about that, if your takeaway from our time together is to have this mindset shift of looking at the communication before the grammar, and that's your big takeaway, that is an incredible place to be. So hopefully you're going to get some great tools along the way as well. But if that's the place you are, that's a great place to be. So then we're going to look at this idea of explicit and implicit grammar teaching, whereas the legacy approach would be more explicit. And we're looking now at more implicit ways of going about grammar teaching or even acquiring structures. So we'll look at the difference of those. And then we have to take on a couple of the questions that everyone has when we bring up this topic of structuring grammars. And it's about the mechanics of language and mechanical drills, which is what a lot of books and approaches have championed over the years. And then we can't ever talk about I can't do a workshop without bringing up Crashing at least once. And then we will finally, after we lay the groundwork, we're going to give you all of those tools you need and those procedures for teaching grammar communicatively and in context. And you will be convinced when we get there that it's something you want to take on because of the groundwork that will lay getting up to there. And when we look at those communicative approaches, we're going to look at structured input, pace, and Dictogloss in particular. There are others, but that's going to be our starting point for our time together tonight. So whenever I start a workshop with teachers, whether I'm in your school working with you, we're at a conference, or here on a webinar, I want to start by laying the groundwork for you to have an action plan. You are going to hear things on here that perhaps are new to you, you've never really heard about before. Hopefully there's a lot that you're doing already and you're going to get confirmation and you're going to walk away and think, wow, I am so on the right track. And that is wonderful. But you're going to hear some new stuff as well. So what I would like to suggest to you is that each new thing that you are interested in, that you put in one of these 4 buckets. Is it something you could possibly do tomorrow? Doesn't take a lot of prep. It's just a slight change in something. You could do something like this tomorrow. Or maybe it's a little more prep and you want to spend a little more time with it. You're going to try it next week. Or maybe you'll hear something and you'll say, that unit that I do on the environment, that would be a perfect activity for that. I'm going to save it for that unit. Or maybe there's something that's larger than that and it's a mindset shift. So what I would like you to do right now, whether you're with me live or watching a replay of this, is just take a piece of paper and put 4 squares on it, just a 4-square grid. And on the top of each one, write tomorrow, next week, specific unit, or mindset shift. And then as we're going through this webinar tonight, when something comes up, by the end, try to have something in each one of these boxes so that you have a very personalized content action plan for you that you could start even tomorrow. Because I find a lot of times in workshops, it can get overwhelming with a lot of information. And hopefully you'll get lots of ideas out of it. But if you follow this little sort of protocol, then you'll make sure to have your own personal action plan as we're going through. So let's jump in. So we're going to start here by looking at the research. And I'm going to focus specifically on Florencia Henshaw and Bill Van Patten here. So the first thing is looking at Florencia Henshaw and this idea of research. And is the research even something that's useful for us, the classroom teachers? And I am a classroom teacher full-time, 26 years, as we said at the beginning. So I'm always looking at, yeah, that's great that research says that, but is it actually useful in my classroom? And this is what I like to bring to teachers in the work that I do is, can we make this useful in our classroom? And Dr. Florencia Henshaw, who recently published, along with Maris Hawkins, the book Common Ground, she has a framework for looking at the research that I have adopted into the work that I do as well. And it's this idea of looking at second language acquisition researchers and teachers. And the reality is, they're not usually working in conjunction. So researchers are out there, perhaps they're in a university environment where they're not actually teaching that stuff in the classroom, but just researching how to do it. And then teachers don't have the time or the resources to be doing peer-reviewed research and all of that. So it tends to be separated. So how do we bring it together and make it a useful experience for everyone? Because we have this idea of the researchers are in the lab, but teachers are in the classroom. And how many times have we sat in PD in our schools and we think, oh my gosh, this isn't going to be the most useful thing. Sometimes it is, but it's also this idea of, have you been in a classroom lately? So we want to make sure that any of that research out there is actually applicable to us as classroom teachers, because there are implications to that. If you're looking at a study that looked at 17 university students and they had this finding from it, that's a very particular study of 17 university students. How is that useful for me? So we have to realize that we as teachers are in a particular context in our schools. We have different student populations and demographics and different languages and different levels of experience in teaching. We all have a very particular context. And so anything that is presented through research as this is being found as the most effective way, we have to look at our own context and say, that is going to work for me. Maybe this won't. And so what we can do is, this is what Florencia Henshaw says, come to a common ground, where we are going to come together and understand what that is. And so what she suggests, and I will also implore you to do, or suggest highly that you do, is anytime we're looking at research, to find clues and commonalities in it that give us an opportunity to question our own beliefs about language learning. So even though the research says, or something like that, what it comes down to is there are commonalities in the research that will help us to refocus our own beliefs about language acquisition and how it's going to happen. And what I find is that most teachers who have been teaching for maybe 10 to 20 years, they have this understanding of the way their teachers taught in their schools 20, 25 years ago. And they're continuing to do that, even though we're finding through research that there's a change. So use the research as an opportunity to re-question those beliefs. So that's what I'm going to look at research with. It's an opportunity to question our beliefs and find clues in it, rather than the you should do this or you shouldn't do that, so that we use it as an opportunity to find more of that common ground. Now, when it comes to Dr. Bill Van Patten, he has some tenets about language learning that I would like to keep in mind for all of us. And he puts out there in all of his research, which has been going on for quite a while through many publications and a lot of work with ACTFL, that he says that acquired language does not resemble rules and charts. It doesn't look like verb conjugations in a textbook. That's not the way our brain. That's not the way our brain processes language and produces language and understands language. That's not what it looks like. That is traditionally what we've been led to believe by the way some things are put out sometimes, but that's actually not the way our brain works with it. So we need to turn that on its head a little bit. And also understand that the idea of language acquisition is largely subconscious, that it's not something that's happening on the conscious level there. And then we also have to respect the developmental nature of language acquisition. So regardless of what order you present grammar structures in, there is a developmental nature of language acquisition that you're not going to change. And that has been borne out in research. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind as we start to look at the way we're going about grammar. And so when we talk about any language acquisition or teaching right now, we talk a lot about proficiency. And so we should have a simple understanding of what proficiency actually is. And what I want to say is that it is what you can do with language and not what you know about language. That is what my working definition of proficiency is. And for our purposes on this webinar, it's what you can do with language and not what you know about it. And if you know a lot of grammar rules and a lot of the way structures work and you can explain that, that's knowing a lot about the language, but it doesn't really show what you can actually do with the language. And we're working towards proficiency. That's something we can all agree on. So just one little extra thing here, looking at the research before we dive into actually teaching this grammar stuff, is to look at the ACTFL core practices. So you see where this idea of teaching grammar in context comes from. So ACTFL has 6 core practices. There are more, but these are generally the ones that are used. And the first one that ACTFL suggests is that we use the target language for learning in the classroom, that we design communicative activities, that we plan with a backwards design model, that we use authentic cultural resources, that we teach grammar as a concept and in context, and that we provide appropriate feedback. Our time together right now is looking very specifically at the idea of teaching grammar as a concept and in context, but it is done in conjunction with all of the others. So as we're doing grammar in context, yes, we are going to use authentic cultural resources to do that. It's going to be part of our backwards design model. So they do have an interplay, but our particular focus today is going to be on teaching grammar as a concept and in context. And what does that even mean? We'll get into that. So now that was our foundation. Hopefully you stuck with me for that 10 minutes of, okay, here's the foundation of the research. You can see, yes, it's bound in research. It's borne out in research. But now this idea of the cart before the horse. And I just want to show you a quote here from Longley and Hillman, who say that to teach isolated grammar structures first for communication later is to put the proverbial cart before the horse. So that's this idea of we learn all these grammar structures and then we find a way to use them to communicate. Or can we flip it and we say, this is our communication goal. This is what we want to be able to do. What are the structures we need to reach that communication goal, rather than trying to retrofit grammar structures into a communication goal? Start with the communication, start with the goal, and then figure out what grammar is needed, because you might find that you're using a textbook that has grammar in it on a theme that doesn't necessarily need to be known or acquired to be able to engage in that communicative theme. So as I said earlier, if this is your big takeaway, your starting point to start looking at communication and then figuring out the grammar, that's a great place to start. And even if we look back at Florencia Henshaw, she also uses very similar language. And she says that we should lead with what we want to communicate and not how to do it. Right. So that is going to be our essential goal, is the communication there. And then we should address the how as needed in the course of communication. So in order to communicate or understand something, whether you're reading or listening or writing, that in order to do that, these are the structures you need. And so therefore you focus on those structures rather than starting with, okay, this is where we do past tense. And once we know past tense, we'll find a way to use it. So address the communication needs, the grammar that's needed in the course of the communication. So now we have that, we can look at this idea of explicit and implicit grammar teaching. Now, again, remember, explicit and implicit, there are different approaches to going about language. And this is where the divide happens amongst teachers, where it's I'm in this camp or I'm in this camp. And we're here today to find the common ground so that we are all working together with the same common goal. So when we are looking for clarification at explicit, so anything that is explicitly taught to students in terms of grammar, we're making this something very conscious. And as we saw at the very beginning with Bill Van Patten, he said that language is largely a subconscious process, and it is. Yet explicit teaching means that we're focusing on the conscious level. So we can already see there's a little of a disconnect there. And then when it's explicit, we're able to verbalize the rules and patterns, not a harmful thing, but it's not a communication aspect. So when we looked at proficiency and we said that if we are able to do something with the language, that's proficiency rather than just knowing about the language. And so the explicit is going to keep us at the knowing. Again, not a bad thing, just not necessarily the end goal of proficiency. And explicit means that it's a lot of meta-linguistic information, being able to say what the subject is and the verb forms or the measure words, whatever you're talking about, the way you agree an adjective or where the adjective goes, lots of meta-linguistic information. And you can know all that and still not be able to communicate. So again, explicit isn't harmful. It's just not the end goal. Our end goal is that implicit knowledge of language, which is going to make it subconscious. And when it's subconscious, it's outside of our awareness. It can't be verbalized. And there's this idea that it's intuitive and it's spontaneous. So the language I'm doing right now, I'm speaking right now, the way I'm languaging right now, as Bill Van Patten sometimes says, is spontaneous and intuitive, and I'm not thinking of the verb forms as I'm talking. So that's our big difference between explicit and implicit. So when we look at those and we talk about teaching grammar in the classroom, we then have to ask our question of how do we go from explicit to implicit? And if you do teach explicit, like you are showing the verb forms and how to do this all in advance, does that eventually become implicit or subconscious language? Yes. Does that happen? No, doesn't. Is there some kind of link? So there are 3 camps on this. So the first one we'll look at is Krashen. Stephen Krashen, he would say, no, explicit explanations of grammar do not lead to implicit subconscious knowledge. He says that explicit learning only results in explicit knowledge, just knowing about the language, but not being able to do something with it. And then we have Ellis and Long, who say that there is a weak connection. It doesn't mean that it's a weak process. It just means that there is somewhat of a connection between explicit and implicit. And so they say that we should focus on form, and conscious attention to that can help. Form means the meaning. So not the verb conjugation, but what it actually means. And then we have the strong connection between explicit and implicit, meaning explicit leads to implicit knowledge of language. And that would be DeKaiser. And he says practice makes perfect. All the mechanical drills, explicit, explicit, explicit. And I have to point out that most second language acquisition scholars do not agree with this. So you could probably see where we're going with our common ground, that we're going to be focusing on the Ellis-Long, somewhat of a connection between explicit and implicit, but not going to the far extremes on each. So why is this so challenging? Like, why? So not everyone agrees with what constitutes evidence of implicit knowledge. Like, how are you able to run a test for something that you subconsciously have in your brain? So you're not even aware of it. Like, how do you test that? So because of that, it makes it challenging to find this connection between explicit and implicit grammar teaching. And it's difficult to measure because we can't run a single test to get there, right? So with all of that, isn't it wonderful when I sit here and I just tell you all the reasons why nobody agrees and all of that? But let's look at what do we agree on, because we do have to find our happy medium and our common ground. So what can we agree on when it comes to this explicit and implicit teaching? And the first thing that we want to recognize and come to terms with is that we all know that learners acquire structures and syntax that are not explicitly taught. That definitely happens. So if we look at this example, my tiny old green delivery bike. Okay, all right, so my tiny old green delivery bike. Now, if you look at this sentence, my green delivery old tiny bike. One of those seems to work, my tiny old green delivery bike. My green delivery old tiny bike doesn't seem to work. Yet somehow we have acquired subconsciously what the correct order is here without ever having it been explicitly taught for us. And in the English language, this might be news to a lot of people because, again, we're never taught that when you put adjectives before a noun, you always go opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose, and then the noun. That's the order that we put adjectives in front of a noun in the English language. Rarely is that taught, and is at no point ever is anyone ever saying, okay, so I have the age and then the color and then the purpose. So what's happening is by exposing students and having them engage with language and see and hear a lot of these different structures, they start to subconsciously get knowledge of it. So it's not at the conscious level. So we can agree that learners acquire structures and syntax that are not explicitly taught. In and of itself, that could be a reason to say explicit grammar instruction isn't necessary at all. But we're going to say that there is some use for it sometime. So the other thing that we can agree on is the goal is to develop implicit knowledge, right? We just saw from that example, that's our goal. Our goal is not just the explicit knowledge of the rules, because that's not actually communicating and doing something with the language. So language acquisition is about mental representation of language. And this is where it can get really theoretical. And that's the thing about things, what's going on in our brain. It's processing language on these subconscious levels, and it's creating all these connections. So our job as teachers is to provide those opportunities for students to engage and then eventually find patterns. And so when we look at teaching grammar communicatively, that's what we're doing. We're helping students find the patterns that they will then take in subconsciously. So where does this leave us? Go back to Krashen. He says, no, don't do anything explicit because it's not going to lead to implicit knowledge. So just be patient. So just do lots of input, and that's it. Just be patient. Eventually they'll get there. And then when we look at the weak connection, which means there's somewhat of a connection between explicit and implicit, we just have to keep in mind that we can't change that order of acquisition that I mentioned earlier from Bill Van Patten. That's not going to change. But, and here we go, here comes our common ground. Conscious attention to certain forms can help move along the stages a little bit quicker. So certain attention, okay? Certain attention to forms, certain conscious attention can lead to stages a little bit quicker. So that's what we are going to be looking at. So how can we find those forms, and how can we do it in a way that keeps communication as the goal, right? Because rules and practice are not going to lead to acquisition. That's not what Ellis and Long are suggesting here. And the other thing that we all have to keep in mind is, in this perfect world of expectations of language acquisition, we'd all work in school systems and departments and classrooms where we are free to just be patient and do all the input. But a lot of times we have a prescribed curriculum that we actually have to do some grammar. It's required, or we're required to use some sort of text that's required to use. So we have to find the happy medium. We have to find ways of communicatively looking at forms to help move this along, because we just don't have the flexibility not to. So our focus here is going to be, how do we show conscious attention to certain forms to help speed up the process a little bit, but done in a communicative way that does not require explicit explanations of the different structures that are coming up. So I just want to point out that Brown, another researcher, said that most of the evidence in communicative second language teaching points to the superiority of implicit approach to rules and generalizations. So that means that students are discovering rules on their own, either consciously or subconsciously. Mostly it's going to happen subconsciously. We're going to help them to do it a little of both. But that the research is showing that implicit shows that it's more effective. But then we have Schaefer, who says the implicit grammar instruction is effective for language structures that are regular and consistent, as this allows students to observe patterns, make generalizations, and form linguistic rules. So Schaefer is pointing out that this is about finding patterns, and patterns only happen when things are regular. So therefore, explicit grammar instruction is more effective for language structures that are irregular or inconsistent and less commonly present in communicative language. So that's a little bit of a shift there, that students are going to subconsciously acquire patterns of language, but not necessarily those more one-off irregular patterns. And there might be some place there for explicit grammar, at least in the research that Schaefer has found. So let's look quickly at mechanical drills, since this comes up so often, and does that lead to acquisition? And so when we look at mechanical drills, and we sort of have something like the big book of Spanish verb drills or something like that. So Van Patten and Wong came up with a study in 2003 where they said the evidence is in and drills are out. So you can kind of figure out what their take is on this. And they're saying that mechanical drills are based on behaviorism. So this is going back to the 50s, 60s, and that practice makes perfect, and that learning a language is like learning anything else, much like DeKayser was saying. But groups doing structured input, which we're going to look at, performed better than those doing just the drills. So the drills group do not make form meaning connections. So yes, you can get them to learn the forms and all those mechanics of the language, but students are not making a communicative connection to it, right? So they're just learning about the language, but not doing something with it. So that's where we have to be careful when it comes to mechanical drills. And then this idea of, but if you do it enough, does it become automatic, subconscious? So acquiring language is not like learning anything else. So that's kind of a misnomer that learning math and learning language are the same, but we all learn language as infants when we couldn't do calculus. So it's not the same thing. So how do we know this? And again, it's because we acquire things from input that are not explicitly taught. Like when I was talking about the adjectives earlier in front of the noun, this particular question, are you a student? You can say, yes, I'm a student. Yes, I'm. Yes, I am. We know that yes, I'm is not correct. You have to say, yes, I am. Or you can say, yes, I'm a student, but you can't say, yes, I'm. Not something that is explicitly taught, yet from the input, we learn and acquire subconsciously that rule. So therefore, we know that drills are not learning to automaticity, because we need to have exposure to the forms of language and the meaning of language to grow the language subconsciously. So I have to just talk a little bit about Stephen Krashen here. So Stephen Krashen, he has his entire input hypothesis, which there's actually 5 parts to it: the acquisition learning, the input, the affective filter, the natural order. The input hypothesis is where comprehensible input comes from. So whenever we talk about CI, that's where it's come from. It's coming from this idea of the input hypothesis, that language needs to be understood for it to be acquired. But the 5th part that a lot of people don't talk about is his monitor hypothesis. And this is where Stephen Krashen leaves open, the father of CI. This is where he leaves open the opportunity for explicit knowledge. And so with Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis, so he says, start with comprehensible input. So this is language that students understand. And then that goes through their affective filter. So that's the thing that makes them happy to learn language, and they don't have a wall up to learning language. And if it can get through that, then it goes into their language acquisition device. This is going back to Noam Chomsky. That's where all the language stuff happens subconsciously in your brain. And then it becomes acquired language. And then you can have output. So that's essentially what Stephen Krashen was saying. But here's the naughty little stepchild, where the monitor happens. And so even Stephen Krashen, who's saying, just comprehensible input, that's all you need, and it will become understood. it'll become subconsciously acquired. He leaves open this idea that the monitor is your conscious, explicit knowledge of the rules that you can kind of put through a filter. Your acquired language goes through that filter, and that you can correct it before it becomes output. So even though Stephen Krashen has this whole idea of comprehensible input, explicit doesn't lead to implicit, he does leave open this idea that having conscious knowledge of the rules, you can self-correct as the subconscious language is coming out. So I just like to put that out there, that the monitor is part of Stephen Krashen's whole model that a lot of times we don't talk about when we're looking at comprehensible input. So there is everything that I've made the case for. So now this is going to go into your buckets. This is where the things you're going to put in tomorrow, or maybe next week, or maybe a little bit of a mindset shift. But let's look at how do we actually teach grammar in a context that's focused on communication, that's leading with communication and not explicit rules. And the essential goal with all of this is that students are understanding what the structures mean and not just how to form them. And by understanding what they mean, that indicates that it's going to become subconsciously learned, subconsciously acquired, rather. And that is the goal of any of these activities, that students are finding the patterns, and by finding the patterns, they acquire them subconsciously. So these are all ways to help students do that without first off explaining the grammar to them. They may pick up on the rules on their own and come up with the patterns on their own, and we can help to shape that. But we're not leading with that, leading with communication and then putting the grammar inside of it. So the first thing we're going to look at, and this is from Bill Van Patten. And so Van Patten and Lee have a very known book called Making Communicative Language Teaching Happen. And this is used in a lot of applied linguistics programs. And it's this idea of structured input is what we call it. And in their book, they describe structured input as input that is manipulated in particular ways to push learners to become dependent on form and structure to get meaning. So it's not just understanding the mechanics of the structure, but the meaning of the structure as well. And if you just learn the mechanics of it, you're not going to know how to use it. So this is a way of going about grammar instruction that makes sure that you are dependent on the meaning and the structure at the same time. So as you're doing anything with structured input, the most important thing is to only focus on one thing at a time. Like if you're looking at verb conjugations, to not look at 4 or 5 or 6 forms of the verb, but just one. So focusing on one thing at a time. And therefore you can keep meaning in focus rather than having to look at all these different forms. And then you're also looking at oral and written input so that students can focus on the meaning orally and in writing. And then you have them do something with the input that is focusing on meaning and form, and that you're moving from just simple sentences to context. And then we have referential and affective activities. That just essentially means that we have extension activities that are not just based on the activity that you're doing, but students do something that is personal to them after. So it's best to look at an example of what this would look like. So this is a Spanish example, and suppose you're working with some sort of text that has things in the present and past tenses here. So you can see the way I have this set up is that it has sentences down the left-hand side, and some are in the present tense and some are in the past tense. But the focus on one thing means that it is just the first person singular. So it's just I, just the yo form. So as students are looking at these sentences, once they've seen examples of them, if they can look at the first one, which hablé, which is I spoke, and then they would either check off ayer, yesterday, or hoy, today. And so there they would check off ayer. So by looking at that, it's a simple change of not saying past and present, but communicatively, it's yesterday and today. And then they'll look at the next one, compro, miro, escuché, estudié, hablo, bailé. So they're looking at the form of the verbs, right? So they're looking at the conjugation form of the verb, and they're recognizing that, yes, that's how you do it, but the meaning of it also puts it in a time, so you're able to use it this way. So you could do it with first person, you could do it with second person. So again, this is just the yo and then the tú. So this is the I and the you here. And again, they're doing the same thing. It's just to look at the form, and does that indicate something that's today or something that happened yesterday? And you'll see that it's just focusing on one thing. And these are simple changes that make it communicative. Rather than saying past or present, by saying yesterday and today, there's nothing grammatical about these, but rather it's keeping it in context. So that's what structured input is. And one of the CLET books, which is Reporteros, in their books, you'll see that a lot of times there are these activities where students are led through sort of this process of structured input. So with this particular one here, it's someone writing about their grandmother and writing about the room at their grandmother's house. And in it, they're using the two verbs that mean to be in Spanish. And so there's one that indicates it's a permanent state and one where things change. So this would be like, say, the starting point if you were using this particular text, where you can look at, what are those adjectives that would use ser, the more permanent to be, as opposed to estar, which is the one that would be more likely to change. So if we do structured input with that, we can look at está limpio, which means it's clean. And then the two columns are changes or doesn't change. So again, it's looking at, okay, so it's that particular adjective would use está instead of es, and it's keeping it communicative because it's change or not change. You can go a step further and remove all of the verbs and just have the adjectives. And so they look at those and they'll say, okay, that's something that would change or not change. And so therefore, now I know if it would be es or está, and that's what you'd be using as an extension activity with it. But you can see that here, we're not talking about explanations, right? It's using it in context, and we're keeping it communicative rather than explaining this is when you do it and this is when you don't. So now I want to look at the PACE model, and this is a little more highly used, and I'm actually going to incorporate as part of the PACE model some of the structured input. So the PACE model is a whole language approach to focus on form, and focus on form means focus on meaning rather than forms, which means the verb forms and the structures. So this was a paper presented at ACTFL in 1992. You can see the authors above. And the whole idea of PACE, which is an acronym, it encourages the language learner to reflect on the use of target language forms. So they're reflecting on the forms. Again, so this is not form is meaning, forms. They're reflecting on the forms, which means say the verb forms, the verb conjugations. So they're reflecting on the meaning of them primarily, and then finding patterns. So the way we would set up PACE is that the teacher and the learners collaborate, and they co-construct a grammar explanation after focusing on the meaning in context. So when we looked at earlier, that whole idea of flipping and starting with communication and then figuring out the grammar you need to get there, that's what this is doing. It's starting with communication and totally understanding, and then looking at the structures that got you there. So the PACE model provides a concrete way for teaching grammar as a concept. So when we say teach it as a concept, that's what we're referring to, that you understand the concept of its meaning and not just the form of the verb, but what it actually means. So when we do PACE, as I said, it's an acronym. So the first thing is presentation. So this is where you, the teacher, foreshadow the grammar structure with emphasis on meaning. You're not talking about the grammar structure. You're putting it in some meaningful context. And then once you've done that, you've talked about it, maybe you've read something, you talk about different examples, you're not focusing on the grammar structure that's in there. You're just focusing on some sort of topic, but embedded in there is going to be the structure that you want to focus on. And once you've done that, then you want to bring the student's attention by focusing on the language form or structure and highlighting it, highlighting that particular linguistic form. And we're going to look at an example. So you start with a presentation of a whole topic theme where you're reading, maybe a little bit of a discussion. Then students will focus on a particular language form that's in there, but they already understand what it means. And now they're going to figure out how it's actually formed. So then this is where the co-construction happens. And this is where the teacher and the student co-construct the explanation of what it is. So you're essentially guiding students into figuring out the patterns and making sense of it and making sure that you're guiding them towards the accurate form and explanation of it. The question always comes up here about what language are you doing this in? I think at the more novice levels, this is going to be in the common language of the classroom. And as you get up into the intermediate levels, this is definitely able to happen in the target language. I know that's always a question that comes up, so I just wanted to put it out there. And then the last part is extension. And this is where students use that grammatical structure to complete a task. Now, again, there has been no explanation to students about how this is done. They've worked with it within a context, within a theme. They've co-constructed what they believe the pattern or the forms are that you are looking at, and then they use that to complete a task that uses that form. And then you could perhaps continue on and have an opportunity to look specifically at that and see if they were correct with what they co-constructed, which as the teacher in this, we want to make sure that they do that. So here's an example. If you're looking at, say, a text message here, and students love to read it that way as a text message, a texting conversation. So this is two people having conversation about what they did last week. And there are all these questions like, what did you do last week? Oh, I did this. Did you do that? No, I didn't do this. So it's all these questions in, they're either speaking in first person saying what they did or in second person asking what they did. So once we've gone through, we can even talk about, oh, what did this person do? When did you do that? Or did you do that last week? Yes or no, either or. And then that's the presentation. And then we go into the point where we're going to highlight for students. So here we can see in red that there are adverbs of time. So it's the word for today, the word for yesterday, last week. So that puts it in context that the form there would then be in the past, and that when it is today, the form would be in the present. And then it's highlighting as well what the forms of those verbs are. So they can see that when it's los compré with the E on the end, oh, so that is past form, as opposed to where I've seen it with compró, which is the present form. So this is where I then have students do a structured input activity with that and say, based on what you just saw, hablé con Raúl, would that be hoy or ayer? I spoke with Raúl, would that be today or would that be yesterday? So it's now adding on this structured input activity onto the PACE model. And then you can do it also with the second person. Is this something that you do today, that you're doing today, or that you did yesterday? So you can see that you can combine some of these things together. Again, there has been no formal explanation of this rule yet. It's just students are discovering the patterns and the explanations on their own. So the last part of PACE is we want to do an extension. So an extension, you could have students do what we call a parallel text. And so this is where you take the verbs out and they replace them with other verbs, but they want to follow the rule that they came up with as they were co-constructing. So they're not going to say this is about buying things, not what you bought, but maybe something you ate, or changing up the verbs that way. Or they could completely write their own. But these extension things make sure that they're taking the rule they came up with and they're able to produce on their own. So this is from the Reporter Francophone, which is the CLET book. Reporteros is the Spanish version, and Reporter Francophone is the the French version. And in this one, this particular text, it's different types of travelers. And when you look at there's the adventurer and there's the gourmet. And in this particular text, it's talking about what that person knows how to do as like the good gourmet traveler or the adventurer traveler. And so in here, once you've talked about that and traveling, you've done all that presentation, then you're highlighting these structures in here and co-constructing the meaning. And this is just like in the Spanish version, it was the two verbs to know. This in French is in the Spanish version, it was the two verbs to be. In the French version here, it's the two verbs to know. So they're saying he knows how to adapt himself, or he knows how to improvise. And then the other one says, I know a good restaurant. So they have to figure out, okay, co-constructing the meaning, like when is it this si to say no, and when is it connaît to mean no? And it's going to work that same way. You could do a structured input with it, but you've led with talking about it first. So it's all in context. And then as you move on from there, some extension activities, you can describe who the active traveler is. And you can see that that's actually left open the way the CLET book sets it up, that the students would then write who the sportif, who the active or athletic traveler is. And it's actually what they tell them to do on the bottom here as well. So it follows right along very much with a PACE model, that you understand it, you get this co-constructed understanding of what these two verbs are, and then using it on your own. So you could do that. You could describe who you are. Which one of these people are you? And again, do it as maybe a parallel text where you switch it out a little bit. So you could also talk about who your friends are, your family that you're going, how they would fall into one of these categories as well. So following the PACE model once again. So talk about the meaning of it, get some idea of the vocabulary, then highlight the structures, co-construct their meaning, and then have students do something with it. So the next one, so that was we did structured input and PACE, and the last one I want to look at is Dictogloss. And so dicto means dictation, gloss is words. So some researchers postulate that requiring learners to engage in output via recreating text may push them to process input more deeply than just working with input alone. So with Dictogloss, again, we start just like with PACE, preparation by being familiar with the topic and what you're talking about, being familiar with the words and vocabulary, and then you do a dictation. And so this, first off, without writing, the teacher reads and the students listen, and then students do some writing. Learners try to reconstruct the passage, but they're doing it from memory, from what you said. So not from one sentence right, one sentence right. And then there's the verification, where learners see the original version and revise and add details, and then an extension. And so it's this idea that you are almost forced to make the form meaning connection by trying to recreate. So if we used, again, an example from the reporteros, in here, maybe you have this family, you're talking about all the activities that they're doing. So we're using the present progressive here. And I would even name everybody in there so you can talk about who's there, what's the relationship amongst the family, and then use these sentences for the Dictogloss and say, so this person is speaking with Raul. Oh, this person is not washing the table. We don't know who they are. So they're just using the present progressive in there. And then we can have them as extension activities. Oh, sorry, went too far. Using extension activities, they can then name somebody that's in the story that is doing one of those. Okay. But again, the whole point of Dictogloss is this opportunity to recreate the sentences that we were hearing. And that's forcing the form meaning connection. So start with something simple like a picture. Make sure you know everything that's going on in there. Then say the sentences, students listen, and then say them again, and then have them write on their own from memory, then check the actual sentences here, and then have them look back at the original picture and say, well, there was a Raul in there, and you can say, oh, okay, it was Maria. Maria está hablando con Raul. So again, they're using it in context. So that's the way of looking at a Dictogloss. So I want to show you a way of doing a unit that uses all of them in there. And I'm going to start by showing you what a write and discuss is. So with a write and discuss, you do any sort of communicative event in your classroom. You read something together, you have a discussion, anything like that. So once students are familiar with a topic, then you have some sort of authentic resource, reading, video, audio, teacher presentation. It can be anything. And then you engage with the content and you have a discussion and the teacher writes a summary of the text on the board with student input, right? And then you're adding in vocabulary as you're going, you highlight focus structures in context, the ones you want to focus on, and then you follow up with some of these grammar teaching methods that I just looked at. So that could be structured input, Dictogloss, or PACE, right? And I recently had a podcast episode with Ben Fisher Rodriguez, and we talked all about write and discuss. And it would be a whole webinar in itself, and it's a fascinating process. So I do recommend that you listen to episode 79 of the World Language Classroom podcast to really understand how it works. But essentially, you engage in some sort of communication, and then you have the students retell the story or retell the topic that you're talking about, and you write it on the board as the teacher, and you add in words if necessary, make sure all transition words are there. Then once you have that text, then you can do any of these grammar teaching activities based on the text that the students helped write, so they know it. So, for example, this was a story that I do all the time with a 8th grade French class, and it's Le Chandail de Hockey. And in this story, it's these boys on a hockey team in 1940s in Quebec, and they love Maurice Richard. So they do everything to be just like him. They wear his uniform. He was for the Les Canadiens de Montréal. He played for them, the best hockey team in the world. So they combed their hair like him. They laced their skates like him. They did everything to be just like him. So we read this story. So then when students are retelling the story, we could just write it out this way. But then what I do is we know the whole thing. So rather than talking about what they normally do, let's talk about as if this happened a long time ago, which it actually did in the story. So when I write all the things on the board that they say that he did, I purposely put it in French in the imperfect. So then I force it on there and I say, okay, I told you that I was going to write it in the past. And so now they look at it and they know that these are things they did all the time to be like him. So when they see them there, they can start to co-construct, oh, these are things they do, normally like now, but these are things they used to do in the past all the time. Oh, so that's what you do to form that verb there. So it's a way of doing the PACE model going in there. And then I add in a structured input, and I either put the sentences in the present or the past. So was this in 1943, or is this something that the kids are doing now? So again, you're doing a structured input activity with that. And then you can do a Dictogloss with it, where you're saying all of the things, but now you're putting it in the imperfect rather than the present tense, which is where they've seen it in the story. And again, they're forcing that connection of the way the I sound is going in there. And then a great way that I suggest with doing imperfect is to do a time capsule. So I'll tell them, write 10 things that you and your friends do all the time. And then I tell them, okay, put it in time capsule. It's the year 2070. And I want you to open it and then tell me the things you used to do all the time using this. So it's a way of taking that one text and then doing the Dictogloss, the PACE, and structured input with that. So that kind of brings us to the end here. So we looked at the research with Henshaw and Van Patten. And remember, if your only takeaway is to start with communication and then figure out the grammar, so don't put the cart before the horse, and those ideas of explicit and explicit grammar and the mechanical drills, they stay knowing about language and not being able to do something with the language. And then you have your ideas of structured input, PACE, and Dictogloss. And as you saw in that last unit, that you can kind of interchange them and use them together within the context of the story. But all of it is done within the context of the story and communication rather than just explicit grammar rules. So hopefully we'll rejoin here and look at your tomorrow bucket, your next week in your specific unit and your mindset shift, and that you have things in there that you can start to take a look at and try. And so now I believe we are going to do some Q&A and figure out from there.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. Thank you so much for that really rich presentation, full of so many practical examples that teachers can take into the classroom, and so many thought-provoking ideas to really get us to, challenge the sorry, what was you referred to them as the legacy practices.
Legacy, yes,
there we go. I love that. To challenge our legacy practices and really think about, how we can incorporate some of these techniques into our teaching. So we do have a number of questions. There's been a lot going on in both the Q&A and the chat. And everyone who's still with us, please feel free to continue to add those questions. We do ask them that you add them in the Q&A. So our first question is one that I think, and I'll just note that we'll try and get to as many as we can. We may have more questions than what we can actually get to in the time we have left. But our first question is one that I think a lot of teachers have found themselves in a situation of dealing with, unfortunately, is how do you deal with a bad prescribed curriculum? So you were talking about the fact that sometimes the resource that you're required to use by your school, your district, is not necessarily the one you would have chosen for yourself, or it may just be one of those legacy resources that there haven't been new materials in a while. It's a little bit dated. So what kind of techniques can teachers use to work within the confines of what they have?
Well, I think if you are within a program where you have to give common assessments, like if there are multiple teachers teaching the same grade or course, and that you're required for common assessments, then whatever you end up doing, you have to make sure. John Bracey, who is a wonderful teacher in the United States, he always says, "Be a great teacher, just don't get fired." Right? So I always like to put out there, he always just says, "Be a great teacher, just don't get fired," because it's one of these things where it's the reality of the classroom, right? That we do work within some prescribed curriculum places, so try to find ways that you can, like, your students have to take that exam at the end like everyone else is, and it's a teacher next door who's just teaching grammar, and you're going to be compared to them. So try to find ways to, within that, lead with communication. So even if it is they have to learn the irregular preterite forms in all the Spanish verbs, they have to learn that, then you could just go about explaining it, or try to find some way of starting with communication. So like when I said, like the cart before the horse, right? So say, okay, so this isn't going to be about the grammar point. This is going to be about what we did last summer, and like leading with that. And again, don't get fired, right? So teach the stuff you need to teach, but try to bring in ways to communicate before rather than after, because I think that's the way the legacy approach is. And it's something we're definitely battling, school districts across the country, across the world, that we need to move away from that. And I think that unfortunately, that the textbooks that often exist in schools for a decade or so, the curriculum is written based on that, and it's outdated pedagogy, and as we get new companies, when we get books that have something that lends itself to pace, like the CLET examples I was giving, like the more of those we have in the classroom, it's like there's, even looking at the examples I use from the two CLET books, it doesn't say use the PACE model here. Like, you're not going to find like, this is good for Dictogloss, this is good for PACE. So you can find the activities in those books that even if you have to do the grammar, there could be a great authentic document or image like the ones I showed. And what could you do with that to bring the grammar in, even though that wasn't brought up in the textbook itself, So just doing our best to lead with grammar. I wish I could go in every school and just be like, stop, stop, stop. But, then everyone would get fired. So I know it's a challenging question, but we're moving.
Yeah, and actually the next question kind of piggybacks off of that, feeds into this, sort of speaking to what you just said, that a lot of the world language textbooks in the USA, and I promise we at CLET did not write these questions. These are questions that people really had, right? Because they might sound like they come from a publisher, but a lot of the books use explicit grammar models and a lot of drill exercises, while books used in Europe focus on a more implicit grammar model. So more concretely, speaking to what you just said, how can you adopt a more implicit communicative grammar approach when the textbook adopted focus is highly on these lengthy grammar explanations? Like, how do you work with that? Do you just skip them entirely? Are there things that you can still kind of pull out from them? What are ways that you can kind of work within that? Because we all know teachers, as much as we'd love to create everything from scratch for ourselves every day, we have enough on our plate. So sometimes you to work with what you've got, right?
Yeah. And I think I'll say, like that I said with the last question, if you have to give common assessments, then you have to get to that place, and I am very personally in a situation like that, in that our students, I teach through 8th grade, and our students go on to secondary schools who have a very different program than we run. We're a very communicative department. The whole school, like, we're all on board with it. And then these students go off and they'll take placement tests that are multiple choice grammar tests, and they get placed in different languages, right? So like I'm aware of that. And if I know that if they don't know all 6 verb conjugations for estar and the acronym of when to use it, and like that, they'll be looked at as not a great Spanish student, so I'm in that situation myself. And what I have actually done is I have a week or 2 here and there where they explicitly know, we're studying this and you have to take this quiz on it. It's not worth nearly as much as all of your other grades, and it's just so you don't place in level 1 when you go to high school. And when we're done with that, we're going to go back to our communicative teaching, and you're going to be teaching and you're going to be speaking and doing all of that. That's the way I've learned to navigate that. Do I recommend it to everyone? You need to figure out what kind of works specifically. If you do not have common assessments to be working towards, I think you have the flexibility to try leading with communication and start the conversation with department heads and those who are writing the curriculum. And it's challenging to change textbooks because that often means changing curriculum. I understand that totally. So do it progressively and not the entire department at once. So like start, and money, yes. And I just saw that in the chat. It always comes down to money. It's always a question of money, right? But like if you could start with your level 1s, and once you see the success that happens there, then it moves into level 2, and then you'll have students going into level 2 who have the background of proficiency language, and then that helps the teachers. So it's when it comes to like the proficiency language, it's really your level 1 teachers that are the ones that are really well trained in it, and then the higher level teachers are getting the students who are already there.
Great point. Thank you. So here's an interesting one. The question came up: authentic text or not for PACE? With the PACE model, do you forcibly always in all contexts need to start with what we would label as an authentic document, an authentic text, or are there ways to work with documents and texts that are a little bit more constructed for certain goals? If you have an opinion on that or thought on that.
I think when it comes to authentic documents, Leslie Grahn always says, adapt the task and not the text, right?
It actually came up in the chat during the webinar too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right. Okay. So this is another divisive thing that's grammar is dividing with language teachers, and so is authentic resources, because there's a camp now that are thinking that if you're not using it for its authentic resource, it's no longer an authentic resource. Like if you're reading a menu for a restaurant in your classroom from Barcelona and you're not in a restaurant in Barcelona ordering food, don't call it an authentic resource, because it's not. So I mean, it's getting very divided even with that. But Florencia Henshaw talks a lot about this as well, and she's like, you get your students reading. Get your students reading. The cultural piece, just be aware of that. Being aware that you want to bring cultural pieces in, and if you want to use authentic resources to bring the cultural piece in, which is what we're doing, then that's not necessarily going to be the same one you're going to use for PACE, because it might be well above their proficiency level, where they are able to interpret it, but not necessarily use it to engage so much with language. So you want a different, more accessible text when it comes to PACE. And so that may not be an authentic document. Like, we think a lot of times, oh, use a children's book, but like in French, children's books are all written in the passé simple. So like that's not at all accessible, to like a level 1, level 2 student, so it's like even being careful with that. But teachers are often asking, like, so where can we get a text from? And so what I would say is using the write and discuss that I just talked about. So start with a text that might be very challenging for them, but then have them do the retelling in their language that's accessible, and embed in what you're writing as their summary, embed in those structures that you want them to focus on, and then that the text is completely understood.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question we have is, should the teacher speak 100% in the target language in class?
So the ACTFL recommendation in the United States is 90 to 100%. And one of the ACTFL core practices is to use the target language for teaching. And 92%. Okay, 80 to 1. I'm looking at the chat, things coming up. So I think that's ultimately what the goal is. But we have to make sure that speaking the target language 100% that's well above their proficiency level is not a good use of their time, because it's not comprehensible input. So doing it just to do it is one thing. If you're going to do it and it's at least 90% comprehensible at the same time, then yes. But if we're doing 100% target language and it's well above their proficiency level, you might as well be doing 40% target language, right? So it's so that should be the goal, but it's not just 100% target language, but comprehensible target language. And if that's not possible, work up to it. And some teachers that are just getting in on this journey, you have to start with, if you're not used to it, try 10 minutes, then move up to 15. And it's also your own stamina, because it's a lot of linguistic gymnastics to stay in the target language at a comprehensible level with students. So, and also for students, the stamina, right? So thinking, okay, tomorrow, that's it. We're going in 100%, right? And then that's not going to work. So you have to create the stamina in students and yourself. But 100% would be the goal, but comprehensible.
Thanks. That's a great perspective. I really like the way that you phrased that and put that there. Really great way to look at it. And so again, a sort of related question, specifically when talking about the PACE model and this co-construction phase, right? Are we doing that always in the target language? And does that vary depending on level and proficiency? How much students and teachers can do in the target language of that particular phase, because it is the one that requires the most sort of student active participation. Or it's the first step that really requires that student active participation of that model, I should say.
Yeah, I think that at the novice level, they're not going to have the language, the output language to do that. But what can happen is there can be maybe even 100% teacher target language, but not necessarily student target language in co-constructing, whereas the teacher could be doing either or, or this or that type of things. As you get into the intermediate level, then definitely I would say strive for the students to be doing the target language as well, communicating and co-constructing in the target language as well.
All right, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Our next question is, do you have any suggestions of how to help our students who are really struggling with the change from the legacy model to the communicative model? So, that's a really interesting one, because you maybe have students, and I myself have taught at a higher ed background, and had this students coming from high schools where the model had been this kind of legacy model or whatever. And so when you have students who are saying, well, where are my verb charts? Where are my, where are my drills? How do you get that student buy-in too, and help them shift their perspective?
Yeah. So that's, I'm making the assumption with that they're coming from a program or previous teachers who taught that way, right? So now you have a teacher who's not. And I think that you're going to have those students that just have an analytical mind. I think a vast majority of us in this conversation right now probably like grammar. We like structure, and so we almost think, well, doesn't everyone like that? And there are definitely going to be students who like that, and they want to enjoy that part of language learning. It's almost like mathematical to them. And it's not going to inhibit their language learning, but the grading, I think it comes down to grades in the United States, right? It's like, what am I going to get graded on? How am I going to get into this college or whatever? And the like grade grubbing kind of things. So I think it's showing them what is going to get the grade. So because I think I have a whole thing on my website. If you go into WOClassroom.com, I have if you search grading or give a grade, I have a whole blog post on my use of proficiency-based grading and providing letter grades based on that. And so I have the whole mathematical breakdown of how to take your scores on interpretive listening and turn that into a letter grade for a report card, because that's what's happening. And I think if students clearly understand that if I get this score on the interpersonal speaking, I will get that grade, and I think it's more that than needing to have the verb charts. It's the I have the verb charts because I know if I learn them and memorize them, know how to spell them, I'll get an A, and then I'll get an A. But it seems more vague, this world of proficiency-based grading and competency-based grading. And it's another part of the shift. But as transparent as we can make that to students, then it'll seem more attainable to them, and also showing them that, oh, go learn all the verb conjugations, but you're still going to take the assessment this way, and you're going to actually realize you don't do as well. But if you don't focus on the verb conjugations and you just do the assessment, you're going to do better. I mean, some of them need to figure it out that way too, right?
Absolutely. So our next question is someone asking for a little bit of clarification on what a parallel text is like. What does it look like? And does it end up sort of looking like sentence frames, or is it more of a closed activity, except that you don't give them the verb, so they come up with it on their own? If you could just expound a little bit more on that.
Yeah. So the idea of a parallel text, it's a CI, a communicative, a comprehensible input practice, and so basically you start with a story. Maybe it can be as long as you want, but then you take out details in the story. And that can be based on the proficiency level of the students. It could just be character names. It could be places they live, and you replace it with the language that you want. And so you're changing up the story a little bit without manipulating the actual structure of the story. And so the example I gave with using a parallel text was with the verb forms. So it was still a conversation about what you did last week. It was still the same two people. We didn't change their names. We didn't change where the questions and answers are. All we were changing was the activities they were doing last week. And so depending on the proficiency level of the students, if they're novice level, what I do with those is I give them a word bank of things that they can put in there. because something might come up like adjective forms in French and Spanish, where they need to, if they put a different adjective in, it might have to be in a different form based on the noun that it's modifying. So I will give them 2 or 3 choices of adjectives that can go in there, and the 3 choices are all in the accurate form. So they have choice in there, and they're also seeing that, oh, everyone that goes in. So I would do the same thing with the past tense on the chat. Like it would be, went and watched, and have them go in that way. So that's what a parallel text is.
Great. Thanks for that
Yeah.
additional explanation. Do you have any suggestions about how to differentiate these kind of lessons? For example, the person who asked the question has multiple levels of Spanish in some of their class periods, and this is not uncommon here in the US, right? You might have a class that is your, French 3-4, your Spanish 4 and AP or something like that. And so, or you maybe have students that need special accommodations, but then also gifted students in the same class period. So what are some ways to differentiate some of these techniques?
So I think that the structures that you're working on, if you want to do it as a whole class, then everybody is essentially going to be getting to the same place. But if you have different levels within the class, if you can do different things, say by stations, where some are doing something that's just a present tense and some are doing something in a different tense or doing something with adjectives, where you start with the same text. Like the whole class is looking at the same authentic document. You're reading the same story, but then different groups can do different things with it. And I'm saying it like that's no work at all. Different groups do different things. Like I totally understand that that means coming up with all the different things like that. But by using the same text, you can have different groups of students approaching it differently, rather than everyone doing the same thing. I had a teacher on my podcast who was telling me that she has Spanish levels 3. No, she has French 3 and 4 together every year in her class. So she does it as a 2-year program. And so she just does different units, but doesn't focus on the grammar. So if you're like in her class, you eventually get to all the units over 2 years. And it doesn't matter what the structures are when she does like pace or something like that, because they're not in a linear order. It's not like, oh, we start with present tense and then we do a regular present tense and then we do past tense and then a regular past tense and then imperfect. That's very much a legacy mindset, that's how you do grammar, because the traditional textbooks would say this is the order in which you do the grammar, an order of complexity, not usefulness. So I think that even though students are at different levels, that whatever you could also do it all together. It's whatever they need to be able to approach that text at that time. Doesn't matter if they're level 3 or level 1. If they need past tense, that's what's needed. A little bit of a mindset shift from the order of complexity grammar syllabus.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I will just have to say, because I'm here, representing CLET, that actually for our series like Reporter Francophone and Reporteros, we offer differentiation worksheets as part of the curriculum. So like you were talking about, you say it as if it's no big thing to, to have to structure it. These are activities that would already be scaffolded for you in that way, that you would have one text that could be done differently with different groups. So so yeah, we as publishers are thinking about this need for differentiation as well. Absolutely. Okay. So the next question is about using actually different, if you need reliable translation resources in class. This person sort of cited Spanish dictionary or DeepL, but that you can sort of get stuck with those. So was wondering if you have a more reliable resource that you would recommend if there's times that you need to be using a translation tool or resource.
So for I know that you're just reading the questions, but I'm going to ask what you think it might mean. Is it like when they're reading and they need to look up, say, a Spanish word to know what it means, or do you think it's the other way? What's your understanding of that question?
I
What
would
do you think?
say that I don't know, perhaps in both senses, right? Because especially if we're thinking about learners wanting to construct their own active vocabulary, right? Because we know that not all learners need the same vocabulary. And so in that sense, maybe you do want your students doing some research and you want to send them to a reliable source that is going to give them the best, the most bang for their buck in terms
Yeah.
of getting them the words that they need to want to continue to communicate in the language. So
Yeah.
let's take it
Yeah.
like that. And then
Yeah.
if there's any more
I
input
think
to it.
there are websites like Word Reference that I think somebody just put that in the chat too. That it's because you get to see it in different contexts. Because a lot of times if you look up a word, you go, oh, that's how you say it.
Right.
Like, oh, like how do you say this in Spanish? You put the word in like Google Translate. It's like this is how you say it, but it's actually not the context, Right. But if you look on Word Reference, you can see lots of different translations for it. Like, oh yeah, that third one down, that's actually what I was looking for. So I think in that, like translating to the target language, but then if it's translating from the text, the target language text to English, like single word things, I mean, if it's a single word, I'm like, just the easiest thing is Google, just Google Translate there with that. But I mean, that's the whole other discussion, is any kind of online translator thing. And I think that the
Right.
answer
That's the
to
third rail, right?
yeah, I think my response to any of the online translator things is that we just have to do a lot more process writing, and not just go and write this paragraph, but you have to have students start with their brainstorm, have them do a brain frame or an outline, and then I have them like make a list on this topic of 10 words, you're going to use, 10 nouns, and then 10 verbs, you're going to use, and then take those and put them into sentences and write. Because if you just say go and write it, I mean, they're all chat GPT in now. So I mean, so it's I've even moved to the point where writing doesn't happen out of my eyesight. And because it's too tempting.
Absolutely. So it looks like we're going to have time for about one more question here. So this one, I think, sort of combines and gets to the crux of a lot of the things we've already discussed. Kind of going over what we've already said. Sometimes so we've already covered some questions about what happens when you're teaching communicatively and you have to do a grammar-based assessment. You're sort of required to do something that is more traditional. But this question is, if your assessments don't seem to match the teaching, if the approach is communicative, but the assessments are not, what would an ideal assessment look like for a communicative perspective? How should we be rethinking how we assess our students as we move in this, communicative model?
So ideally, and again, this is ideal, that all of our units would be IPAs, which are integrated performance assessments. And that just means that you are assessing on all of the communication modes. Interpersonal, you're doing interpretive, maybe interpretive reading and listening, presentational speaking and writing, and then also an intercultural. So you could possibly, ideally have 5 parts in this 2-day testing situation. So that's really what it comes down to, is even if this is new to teachers, that with your next assessment, make sure that there are at least 2 of the communication modes. Not just that they're on the assessments, but then you actually do them in class to prepare students as well, and move up. Then the next one has 3 of the communication modes. I think that's ideally what we're getting to. And when it comes to grading, and again, not like the translating the proficiency grade to a letter grade and all of that, and looking at what your grading categories look like, that at the novice level, where interpretive is so much more foundational than the output of writing and speaking, that's a higher percentage in your grade book. that it's 40% of their grade is interpretive assessments, because that's so foundational. And as they get up into the intermediate level, then it can be 25, 25, 25, and a 25 formative category. But to honor that fact, and if you're going to make at the novice level interpretive 40%, make sure that 40% of your class is interpretive, and go out that way. So that would ideally the IPA situation.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That's really helpful talking about those percentages, and good to know that, we're on the right track here with our materials, because we do offer IPAs for several of our series. So really, really helpful way to rethink how we sort of traditionally do assessment. So thank you. All right. Well, we are coming up right on our 7:30 time mark for the closing of our webinar. So Joshua, I just want to thank you sincerely again for being here with us this evening. This has been a wonderfully productive conversation. And, we have lots of love in the chat and the Q&As for everything that you've shared. Lots of people, looking for even more information and tips, and just saying how great and helpful this webinar was. So we really appreciate your time. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise, and it's been really lovely to spend the evening with you.
Yes, absolutely. I quite enjoyed myself. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And, au revoir and adios. And
au revoir, adios.
Yes. Have a good evening to all.